The arrival of Allied troops in Normandy during World War II was one of the great blows that marked the beginning of the fall of the Third Reich. But it was also the scene of a fierce revenge. The horrors perpetrated by the Nazis, with Adolf Hitler at the head, were heard by soldiers around the world, and now they could see this with their own eyes. From tortured bodies to brutal mass murders, that hatred accumulated against the cruel German regime exploded into new war crimes. But this time carried out by members of the other side. The dominance of the Führer's men was over, and the hunters became the prey. That is why in this new military history video, we will travel to the French coast to learn about the bloody executions of German soldiers that were never told. Make yourself comfortable, because we are about to learn some of the secrets that remained hidden for almost 80 years. And the time has come for them to come to light.
Still today, there are many war crimes and stories which are being uncovered about the Second World War. On a daily basis, different soldiers are being exhumed from the battlefields of Europe, 80 years after the conflict had gripped the continent. But recently, a 98-year-old surviving member of the resistance spoke out and told of the executions of up to 40 German soldiers who were executed by the French resistance following D-Day.
The Normandy landing, also known as D-Day, is one of the great military feats in history. Its complexity, the use of resources, its execution, and, above all, its consequences, have made it one of the most decisive operations of the Second World War in favor of the Allies. 80 years have passed since the event, which took place on June 6, 1944, but whose preparations had begun long before. Its success was the result of meticulous planning and waiting for the exact moment to go against a Nazi army that seemed unstoppable. During the first 2 years of the war, Adolf Hitler and his lethal forces swept across Europe almost without resistance, including the fall of France and a siege of Great Britain, which was able to avoid the domination of the Third Reich thanks to the efforts of the brave pilots of its Royal Air Force. In any case, the bombings of the Luftwaffe also turned the English streets into a true hell. However, relief for that region would come in 1941, when the Führer decided to put his efforts into a new initiative that bore the name of Operation Barbarossa. It was the invasion of the powerful Soviet Union, a former ally in the conquest of Poland that was sought to be betrayed in order to definitively shore up the Nazi Empire. The German troops had some successes advancing into Russian territory, above all thanks to the support of independentist rebel groups that also sought the fall of Joseph Stalin. Until suddenly, they encountered resistance that was impossible to defeat in the fierce Battle of Stalingrad, where the Red Army wiped out a large part of the German armed forces, better known as the Wehrmacht. Hitler had no alternative but to withdraw his forces, which had been decimated, and could not afford to neglect the Western Front, where the Allies were preparing the coup de grace. Planning for Operation Overlord began in 1943. In the months leading up to the invasion, a major deception mission called Bodyguard was carried out. which sought to confuse German forces by leaking information about different dates and locations for the attack. However, the place and day for the largest seaborne assault in history were already in place. Even so, despite so much preparation, not everything went as expected, as the weather played against it, causing the landing to be delayed for several hours. But that was not all.
D-Day took a huge amount of planning, and there were incredible attempts made to deceive the enemy, but also the operation encountered problems as it had to be put back 24 hours. However, there were things that did not go well on D-Day, as at Omaha and on many of the other beaches, there was a significant amount of resistance put up. The shores were mined and barbed wire covered the beachhead, and to make things worse, there were many machine gun emplacements and other fortifications established to repel the Allies.
Despite all the setbacks encountered by the US-led troops, the invasion achieved its goal. To give an idea of this unprecedented deployment, the Allied forces had 34 infantry corps, more than 500 planes including bombers, fighters, and transport squadrons, and more than 9,000 ships with 76 warships and 5,000 boats. In addition, there were about 3,500,000 soldiers available. As for the German response, they had 10 infantry divisions, 12 panzer divisions, and 5 heavy armored battalions. The large difference in numbers was decisive. Not to mention that the Führer's forces were more worn down by the constant battles in which they sought to conquer land and then hold it in their power against the resistance. This does not mean that the Nazi army was not a great rival during the invasion. It is estimated that American troops lost more than 20,000 men killed in combat, with another 10,000 missing. Similarly, the British suffered about 16,000 fatalities, and the Canadians more than 5,000, making these armies the largest in the alliance. However, these figures seem small when you consider the impact on the Germans. Beginning on D-Day, Allied forces in northern France reported capturing 47,000 Nazis in June, another 36,000 in July, and 150,000 in August. Of that total, an estimated 80,000 soldiers were found buried in Normandy after their deaths. The numbers also vary depending on the available sources and the time periods in which they are placed. Some include German losses in attacks on air and naval bases, as well as the advance of troops on French soil, reaching estimates of over 200,000 dead, and in some cases close to 300,000. The only certainty is that the landing and the days that followed were brutal, with bloody battles and terribly cruel episodes. Although war itself gives rise to death, in this case it also served as the stage for the most atrocious revenge.
One thing to consider is that the Allies, when they made advances, did not have the time often to take prisoners, and because of this some men were slaughtered and killed when they should have been probably taken as prisoners of war and given this form of protection.
But as we mentioned earlier, the Allied casualties were also high. In this case, the Canadian forces are part of a sinister statistic. 1 in 7 soldiers who were killed between June 6th and June 11th died after surrendering in a series of executions that would be called the Normandy massacres. In total, there were 156 prisoners of war, among which there were also 2 British. Members of the SS managed to capture them in various confrontations during the first days of the battle on French territory, and then decided to kill them either individually and spontaneously, or in a massive and premeditated way. Witnessing these atrocities, many of the Allied fighters showed no mercy when it was their turn. Thus, many German soldiers failed to avoid being shot by their enemies, despite surrendering. Both American, British, and Canadian forces joined in these practices. There were a number of French witnesses who later spoke about Nazi troops being executed in the days following the Normandy landings. Some of the most widely noted for this behavior were the American paratroopers involved in the operation. They were said to have brutally executed 25 German prisoners on the side of a road in the evening of the day following the landings. Several of these soldiers claimed that the dead had been wounded in battle while trying to defend the beach. However, it is believed that the Germans were held in front of a farmhouse for several hours until the Americans guarding them decided to take their weapons and shoot them dead. In this way, they acted as judges and executioners over the fate of the prisoners of war. They were motivated by hatred of the practices of the Third Reich and had a special interest in hunting down the most atrocious members of the Nazi regime.
The SS officers and members were seen as prized targets for execution by many Allied soldiers, as they were considered the most dangerous soldiers and also those who were the most ardent of Nazis, and many Allied soldiers had heard about the crimes that the SS members had been involved in.
Years of hearing about the ruthless actions of Adolf Hitler's men fed a monster thirsty for revenge. This is why, when faced with an opportunity, the Allied paratroopers showed no mercy to the Germans once they began to conquer enemy positions. Another example of this was what a military police officer from the 101st Airborne Division saw, who found the corpse of a Nazi officer and observed that someone had cut off one of his fingers to steal his wedding ring. There was also the testimony of a sergeant from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, who could not help but be horrified when he saw that some of his men had stabbed to death a group of Germans and then continued to test on their corpses how sharp their bayonets were. The brutality of some soldiers surprised even their comrades. On one occasion, a soldier asked another why his gloves were red and not yellow like everyone else's. The answer left him disgusted, since to make it more graphic, the man consulted took out of his pocket a large number of ears that he had cut off the bodies of his enemies. He had, literally, the blood of his rival on his hands. According to the accounts of those days, some paratroopers even lost their heads. In one of his works, the British military historian, Anthony Beevor, describes a tense situation that took place in the middle of the night after the jump over Normandy, and that almost ended in tragedy. Apparently, a lieutenant and a chaplain were talking to French civilians when they were approached by a dozen commandos from the 82nd Airborne Division. They were escorting several very young German prisoners, whom they ordered to lie on the ground. When they were about to shoot them, those present persuaded the officer in command of the unit to stop. After being convinced, they left. But they did so shouting, "Let's go find some German to kill." But evil came from both sides. One Allied soldier also explained in his memoirs why such atrocities had been committed. He recalls multiple occasions when he'd seen the lifeless bodies of his comrades with their mutilated testicles in their mouths. His captain made it clear what to do after seeing such carnage. "We don't want a single prisoner. Those bastards are shot." This only goes to show that World War II was incredibly brutal, regardless of flag.
But there are many other atrocities and war crimes that were committed by the French resistance, known German soldiers who had even been buried inside of Britain, who died in prisoner of war camps here.
This brings us to a very particular case, where the protagonist was the French resistance. When we talk about the landing in Normandy, we cannot leave aside the support of this group, which was a key factor. This force, with approximately 350,000 people, carried out sabotage work during the last days before the invasion. Its members caused the derailment of trains by cutting 37 lines, which made the only way to get German reinforcements to the front by road. In the last moments, the French also put into action the Violet Plan, which meant cutting the Nazi communication cables. This forced the fighters of the Third Reich to use the radio to make announcements of the arrival of the Allies, which allowed them to be decoded by the British bases. Their contribution was valuable in the planning of the attack, but if the members of these groups were caught by the enemy, they would have to pay a very high price.
In the build-up to D-Day, the British and Allied nations were planting spies inside of France to work with the French resistance. They would play a key role in the Normandy landings, disrupting and delaying the Germans, who would make their way to the north of France following the landings. But the French resistance were known to have been a brutal foe for the Nazis, and they were a feared enemy. If members of the resistance were discovered, they were usually executed quickly and swiftly by the Germans, with very little questions asked.
These French fighters began to see action as soon as the Germans occupied their country. It was very difficult for the Nazis to hunt them down, but when they did, they were immediately killed, although in some isolated cases, they were also sent to concentration camps, where they would later end up dead due to the living conditions in those places. These heavy-handed policies adopted by Hitler's troops caused elements of the French resistance, also called the Maquis, to go and live and take action in the mountains and forests. However, D-Day changed everything, and the year 1944 was particularly key for the force that wanted to regain control of its territory and eradicate the Germans forever. Being part of the Allied troops, they were protagonists of many confrontations and were finally able to celebrate the victory, becoming heroes for their nation. Over time, they were honored and recognized for their enormous bravery and patriotic work, although there was a part of history that was kept secret every time a celebration was held in their honor. It took a long period of almost 80 years for the terrible secret to come to light. The person responsible for telling the atrocious event that took place on June 12, 1944, was Edmond Rivet, the last living member of the French resistance group that participated in the execution of 47 unarmed German soldiers who had surrendered. They were captured as prisoners, but without the possibility of continuing with that burden on their way to the liberation of France. The order came that they should be killed without mercy as a response to Nazi crimes. The man had lived with a suffocating secret for a long time, and at the meeting of an association dedicated to preserving the memory of veterans, he could no longer contain it. It was in 2019 and in his village, when Edmond Rivet was already 98 years old and was far from being that young man who witnessed the atrocities of the war. Despite the weather, even the local mayor, Philippe Bruguière, was understanding and supportive.
It was said that when he spoke, it was like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and the mayor said, over the years he had plenty of opportunities to tell the story and never did, but he was the last witness. It was a burden to him. He knew that if he did not speak out, then no one would ever know.
Rivet was present when the resistance group he belonged to shot 47 German soldiers and a French woman accused of collaboration, who had been captured 5 days earlier in Tulle, capital of the Corrèze department. Rivet was almost 19 years old and was a liaison officer when the incident occurred. He said he did not take part in the shooting, but was part of the team that pulled the trigger, and said it was necessary for this massacre to be known as it showed how in wars heroes can often also commit brutal acts. What the elderly Frenchman was talking about was revenge, which was again the protagonist in the savage clashes. He recalled that 3 days after the landing in Normandy, the Nazis counterattacked and captured several Allied fighters. They then promptly hanged and publicly executed approximately 100 of them. In the days following D-Day, more horrors would occur. The Germans discovered the charred remains of Helmuth Kempfe, an SS commander, who had been locked inside a field ambulance, which they later set on fire. The SS division Das Reich then massacred 643 people inside the village of Oradour-sur-Glane, where the Nazi had been kidnapped. The women and children were locked in the church, which was then set on fire, and the men were locked in a barn and shot with machine gun fire before the place was set on fire. The struggle continued, blow by blow and with increasing violence to prove which side was the most implacable. In this scenario, Edmond Rivet, who had participated in the Tulle uprising, joined a group of resistance members heading east to Meymac. As the climate became more tense and the revenge became more and more bloodthirsty, no one wanted to have anything to do with the prisoners, as they did not know what to do with them.
So these men accompanied the German prisoners they had captured. They then took them to Meymac. Some of the prisoners had become separated from the main group, and it was said, if a prisoner wanted to take a pee, he needed to be guarded by 2 of us. We hadn't planned anything for food. We were under the orders of an Allied command centre, and they were the ones who gave us the order to kill them.
This meant that the killing of prisoners was no longer exclusively for revenge. Other justifications also came into play, such as the lack of resources to maintain the captured Germans. Whatever the reason given at the time, the executions were completely real and had been etched into Rivet's memory.
In the countryside, he said, it was a terribly hot day. We made them dig their own graves. They were killed and we poured quicklime on them. I remember it smelled of blood. We never spoke again. For over 75 years, this secret would remain close with the witness, and it's clear that it must have played on his mind, that if he didn't get it off his chest, then it would have gone with him to the grave.
The rest of the executioners who massacred dozens of German soldiers were dead, but that would not be the end of the story. After committing these acts, none of them were allowed to tell what had happened for many decades. It is believed that in 1960 they were close to discovering it when a group of archaeologists found 11 bodies belonging to Nazi fighters. However, later the excavations came to an end, and there were no records that indicated the specific details of the event. It is likely that the lack of information about this crucial event of the war truncated a possible investigation. In fact, it was not until Edmond Rivet's statements that we were able to learn about the true fate of these corpses. The former member of the French resistance collaborated with new teams in charge of the excavations, but no great progress was made. In any case, even without that piece, history was rewritten to get a little closer to the truth. After the war, Rivet left the resistance and joined Général de Lattre de Tassigny's First Army, which participated in the liberation of France and advanced as far as the German city of Stuttgart. Finally, after serving in his country's armed forces, he returned to the profession of railwayman that had accompanied him before enlisting, and proudly tells that during the 1970s, he held the position of deputy chief of the Austerlitz station in Paris. However, his past never left him. Now, after learning about these fierce episodes of revenge during World War II, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in our next installment of Military History.